Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we are going deep into the world of risk classifications, specifically how we categorize pharmaceuticals, food, and medical devices based on the potential for harm, and even more importantly, how those categories and the regulations around them are going to be shifting as we head into 2025.
You've hit the nail on the head. It really is a constantly changing area. For anyone involved in bringing these products to market, it's absolutely crucial to have a grasp on these classifications and to be prepared for what's coming.
Absolutely. And we know you're busy, so we've gone through the FDA, the EMA, and the WHO regulations to pull out the need-to-know information. This is your streamlined guide to understanding what these risk levels are, how they're determined, and what the coming changes mean for compliance and safety.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. At the end of the day, risk classification is all about figuring out just how much potential for harm a product has. That's how regulatory bodies decide how much oversight a product needs before it can reach the consumer. It's kind of the framework that guides regulatory oversight, I guess you could say.
Exactly. So something that could cause major problems if something goes wrong during its creation or if it's used incorrectly, that's going to get a lot more scrutiny. And obviously, the goal here is to keep people safe, those who will be using these products.
Yeah.
So let's start with pharmaceuticals. How does this whole risk classification thing work in that space?
Okay, so for pharmaceuticals, the classification system really comes down to the potential impact on a person's health. That basically dictates how much regulatory oversight is needed to keep patients safe. And globally, organizations like the International Council for Harmonization, the ICH, and Good Manufacturing Practices, GMP, really provide the overarching structure for assessing and managing those risks.
So what are the main risk categories that we're talking about when it comes to drugs?
Well, we typically see three main categories. First, you have your low-risk products. Those include like your over-the-counter meds, things like your basic pain relievers, herbal supplements, vitamins, that sort of thing. They've got a well-established safety record, and there's very little chance they'll cause serious side effects if you use them as directed.
Okay, makes sense. The things you can usually pick up without needing a prescription from your doctor. So then what's the next level up? What makes something medium risk?
So medium-risk drugs. These are prescription drugs that might have potential side effects. They might interact with other medications a patient's taking, or there might be, contraindications, certain cases where the drug shouldn't be used at all. Because of those issues, these drugs need a doctor's supervision. But as long as they're used according to the guidelines, they're considered to be safe and effective.
Okay, so more regulatory attention than the over-the-counter stuff, but still generally safe as long as the doctor is involved.
Yeah.
And then there's the high-risk category.
Yes. This is where things get a lot more intense on the regulatory side. This category includes controlled substances, things with the potential for abuse or dependence. It also includes your biologics, gene therapies, and oncology drugs. These have a much higher likelihood of causing severe adverse reactions, so they get the strictest regulatory oversight. They have to go through extensive clinical studies before approval and often even require ongoing risk management plans after they're already out on the market.
Wow, it sounds like regulatory agencies look at a whole bunch of different factors when they're trying to decide what risk category a drug falls into.
Oh, absolutely. They're looking at any adverse effects that have been reported from clinical trials and post-market data. They consider potential interactions with other medications a patient might be taking and specific issues related to certain patient populations. It all builds a more complete picture of the drug's overall risk profile.
Gotcha. Okay, that covers pharmaceuticals pretty well. Let's move on to food. How does risk classification work in the food industry?
Food safety risk classification is a really big deal. And globally, you have organizations like the FDA here in the US, the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, and the Codex Alimentarius Commission. They all set the standards. And here, the classification is largely based on how likely it is that a food product will get contaminated. It also considers what kind of additives are used to make it and the processing methods. So the classification then determines how strict the safety controls need to be for producers, storage facilities, distributors, and all that.
So just like with pharmaceuticals, there are different levels of risk for food.
Yes, you've got your low, medium, and high risk categories. Low risk foods are usually things like, your packaged dry goods, canned foods, processed foods that have a long shelf life. They typically have low water activity and are packaged in a way that protects them, so they're inherently less likely to be contaminated.
Right, the things that aren't as likely to spoil quickly. And then what about medium risk foods? What puts them in that category?
Medium risk foods require a bit more care and handling. Things like dairy products, meat, poultry, they all fall under this category. These types of foods need to be refrigerated and handled carefully to prevent bacteria from growing and causing foodborne illnesses.
Okay. So then high-risk foods would be the ones that need the most attention and have the highest potential for problems.
Exactly. High-risk foods are the most vulnerable to contamination, which means they need the most thorough safety controls. Think raw seafood, ready-to-eat meals that don't need further cooking, unpasteurized dairy, and all sorts of other highly perishable items. The chances of bacterial contamination are much higher with these foods.
Now, our outline mentions this upcoming mandatory compliance with HACCP in 2025. What is that and why is it such a big deal?
Right. So HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. It's a science-based way of approaching food safety. It's all about preventing hazards before they happen rather than reacting after the fact. So making HACCP compliance mandatory in 2025 means that all food manufacturers will be required to have those preventative measures in place, strong quality controls, and a clear system for tracing products back to their source. It's a big step forward for consumer safety as a whole. So the 7 principles of HACCP, which include hazard analysis, identifying critical control points, establishing limits, monitoring procedures, corrective actions, verification, and record keeping. All of these provide a framework for this more proactive approach.
It does sound like a pretty major shift to a more preventive approach to food safety. All right, let's tackle our last category here, medical devices. How do we classify those based on their level of risk?
Okay, so medical devices are classified based on a few key things: how they're meant to be used, how invasive they are, or how much they interact with the patient's body, and the general risks associated with their use. There's been a real push to harmonize these classifications globally through organizations like the FDA, the European Medical Devices Regulation, the EU MDR, and the ISO 13485 standard.
So what are the different classifications for medical devices?
We usually see 3 main classes: Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. Class 1 devices are considered low risk. Think bandages, basic handheld surgical instruments, and any non-invasive device that presents minimal risk to the patient. They're subject to basic regulatory controls and don't usually require extensive clinical testing before they can be sold.
Straightforward enough. Minimal risk, minimal hoops to jump through. What about Class 2 devices? What makes them different?
Class 2 devices have a moderate risk level. We're talking things like infusion pumps, diagnostic imaging systems, powered wheelchairs, stuff like that. Because they have a greater potential for risk compared to Class 1, they face more regulatory scrutiny. This means they're subject to more thorough performance testing, and they need to have quality management systems in place to minimize those risks.
Okay, so more checks and balances in place for those. So then Class 3 devices would be the highest risk classification.
That's right. Class 3 devices are the high-risk ones that directly support or sustain human life. Pacemakers, artificial heart valves, other implantable devices all fall under this category. And because they have the potential to really impact a person's vital functions, they go through the most stringent evaluation process. That includes lots of clinical trials, they need pre-market approval from regulatory bodies, and they require rigorous, ongoing post-market surveillance to make sure they stay safe and effective over the long haul.
And it seems like, just like with food, there's a bigger emphasis on those post-market activities for medical devices, especially looking ahead to 2025.
Yeah, for sure. Beginning in 2025, there's going to be a greater focus on continuous post-market surveillance for medical devices. This means manufacturers will be required to actively monitor their devices once they're on the market, report any bad events that happen, and track their performance in real-world use. It's all about making sure patients stay safe and that the device keeps meeting regulatory requirements throughout its entire life cycle.
This is all so incredibly helpful and detailed. Let's zoom out a bit now and talk about some of the key regulatory updates every one of these industries should be aware of as we head towards 2025. What are some of the specific modifications in pharmaceutical regulations that we should have on our radar?
So in pharmaceuticals, we're seeing a few major shifts. The FDA, for instance, is placing a lot more emphasis on what we call real-world evidence. This is data collected from patient experiences outside the controlled setting of clinical trials. It's part of their drug approval process. It's a move towards understanding how drugs work in diverse patient populations. And this means manufacturers need better infrastructure and analytics capabilities. They're also starting to use AI-based systems for risk assessment. At the same time, both the EMA in Europe and the MHRF in the UK are pushing for more transparency around clinical trial data. They want to make more information publicly available. And globally, there's a push towards implementing common guidelines for pharmaceutical quality, which is aimed at standardizing GMP compliance across different countries. This should make things easier for manufacturers operating in multiple countries.
Interesting. So more emphasis on real-world outcomes, AI integration, transparency in clinical trials, and global standardization. Now, switching gears to food safety, what are the big trends we're seeing emerge there as we approach 2025?
In food safety, a major trend is the move towards tougher digital record keeping to improve traceability. This will make it easier and faster to track food products if there's contamination or a recall. We're also seeing stricter rules for food additives and artificial ingredients, mainly because of public health concerns. And then, COVID-19 really exposed weaknesses in global supply chains. So as a result, there are stricter regulations around importing and exporting certain food products to make sure they're safe.
Those supply chain disruptions definitely highlighted how interconnected our food system is and why strong safety measures are so important. Okay, now what about medical devices? What compliance changes are on the horizon for them?
For medical devices, the European Medical Devices Regulation, the EU MDR, is bringing in much stricter pre-market approval requirements, especially for those high-risk Class 2 and Class 3 devices we talked about earlier. We're also seeing an expansion of the Unique Device Identification System, UDI, to include not just single-use devices, but also reusable and even software-based medical devices. This will make tracking devices much easier throughout their life cycle and improve accountability. And with more and more medical devices being connected, there's a growing emphasis on strong cybersecurity protocols to protect them and the sensitive patient data they hold.
It seems like the regulatory landscape for all three of these sectors is becoming a lot more complicated and demanding. So with all these changes coming up, what are some essential risk management strategies that companies need to prioritize?
The foundation of good risk management is having a solid risk assessment framework in place. And that involves a few key steps. The first one is hazard identification. It's basically a really thorough process of identifying all the potential risks linked to your products. That could be contamination in food, side effects from drugs, device malfunctions, you name it. And these risks need to be considered at every step, from sourcing raw materials to how the consumer uses the product.
Okay, so first you have to identify all the things that could go wrong. What's the next step in the framework?
Next, you move into risk analysis. This is where you figure out how likely each of those risks is to actually happen and how severe the harm would be if they did. This usually involves looking at historical data, results from clinical studies, if there are any, and any real-world evidence you've gathered.
Got it. So it's not just about listing potential problems, but really understanding how likely they are and how bad they could be. What comes after that?
The next step is risk mitigation. This is where you put specific controls in place to reduce those risks, or hopefully eliminate them entirely. This might mean more rigorous quality testing, improving your manufacturing processes, or even redesigning a product to make it safer. The whole point is to be proactive and make sure your products are safe and effective.
Makes sense. Identify, analyze, and then take action. Now, the outline mentions the increasing role of things like AI and machine learning and risk monitoring. How are those technologies being used?
Artificial intelligence and machine learning are game changers for risk monitoring. As we move toward 2025, we'll see them used even more widely to detect safety issues in real time across pharmaceuticals, food, and medical devices. These systems can analyze huge amounts of data really fast, way faster than humans, and spot subtle patterns that might indicate contamination, defects, or potential problems for consumers. And often they can do this before those issues become major problems.
Wow, it's like having a super smart early warning system. What about blockchain and the Internet of Things, IoT? How do they fit into all of this?
They play crucial and complementary roles. Blockchain, with its security and transparent record keeping, is perfect for improving supply chain transparency, something we'll talk more about in a minute. And IoT lets you keep tabs on important environmental conditions, things like temperature and humidity during production, storage, and distribution. This ongoing monitoring helps make sure products are handled properly, reducing the risk of spoilage or anything else that could affect safety and compliance.
So blockchain for an unchangeable record and IoT for real-time environmental tracking. Sounds like a powerful combination for preventing problems. Let's dig into this supply chain transparency thing a little more. Why is that so important for risk classification and management?
Well, the thing is, risk isn't just about the final product itself. Weaknesses in the supply chain can also be a big issue. Things like contamination of raw materials, counterfeit products, suppliers not following regulations. These can all have a domino effect and compromise the safety and quality of the final product. As we look towards 2025, the transparency that blockchain offers could really change how companies manage their supply chains. It creates a permanent record of every transaction and every time goods are moved, giving you traceability from the raw materials to the final distribution.
So you can basically trace the entire journey of a product from start to finish.
Yeah, exactly. And when you combine that with IoT sensors that are constantly monitoring things like temperature and humidity during shipping and storage, you get a much clearer picture of the entire product life cycle. This helps to prevent disruptions, makes everyone in the supply chain more accountable, and builds trust with consumers because they know the products have been handled safely and checked for quality every step of the way.
It really underscores why knowing where every piece of a product comes from and how it's been handled is so important. Now, one final point on risk management strategies. The outline mentioned the importance of employee training and regular compliance audits. Why are those so crucial?
Well, you could have all the fancy technology and the best risk assessment plan in the world. But if your employees aren't properly trained, if they don't understand how important it is to follow regulations and procedures, then your system is still vulnerable. It's really important to have continuous, up-to-date training on things like GMP, food safety protocols, and medical device regulations. This helps reduce errors, keep product quality consistent, and lower the risk of noncompliance. And these training programs need to keep employees up to date on all the changing standards from regulatory bodies like the FDA, EMA, and ISO. Everything from handling raw materials to the nitty-gritty of manufacturing and quality control.
So it's about building a culture of compliance within the entire organization.
Exactly. And having regular internal compliance audits is key too. This helps identify any gaps in your processes, see how effective your procedures are, and make sure you're consistently meeting all the regulations. Strong training and auditing build a sense of accountability, which in the end helps make your products safer.
This has been such a thorough overview of proactive risk management. Let's shift gears one last time and talk about common mistakes companies make in these highly regulated industries. More importantly, how to prevent them. What's a really common pitfall you see?
One of the most common issues is inadequate documentation. Keeping accurate, complete, and easy-to-access records is absolutely essential. If you don't do this, you could end up with hefty fines, product recalls, and even lawsuits.
Yeah, that sounds like an area where oversights can have serious consequences. What's the solution to avoid those documentation problems?
Investing in and using automated documentation systems is really important. These systems let you record data in real time, which cuts down on human error, makes it easier to trace your products, and simplifies those regulatory audits.
That makes a lot of sense. Using technology to make documentation more efficient and accurate probably saves a lot of trouble down the line. What's another common mistake you see?
Another big one is misclassifying products, whether it's a drug, a food, or a medical device. If you get the classification wrong, you might end up going down the wrong regulatory path for approvals. That could lead to delays in getting to market or even violations later on.
It sounds like getting that classification right from the get-go is essential. How can companies avoid making that mistake?
The best approach is to get advice from experienced regulatory consultants. They know the classification guidelines from the FDA, EMA, and other bodies inside and out. And there are also some new AI tools popping up that can help with classification by analyzing the product's risk, its intended use, and the safety data. And it's also really important to regularly review your product classifications because the regulations and our understanding of risks can change over time.
Combining human expertise with AI seems like a smart move. What's the last common mistake you'd like to highlight?
The last big mistake is ignoring post-market surveillance. Just because a product has gone through approvals and is being sold doesn't mean you can stop worrying about its safety and performance. If you don't do good post-market surveillance, you might miss adverse effects, which could lead to penalties and recalls, both of which can really hurt a company.
So it's not just launch it and forget it.
Nope, not at all. Post-market surveillance is an ongoing responsibility. It's how you catch any long-term risks or performance issues that maybe didn't show up in the initial testing. Companies need strong post-market surveillance PMS systems. That means actively collecting and analyzing real-world data on how the product is performing, using AI analytics to spot trends or red flags, and even taking consumer feedback into account.
This has been such an informative deep dive. As we wrap things up, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners as they think about 2025 and beyond?
The key thing to remember is that risk classification in these industries isn't set in stone. It's always changing based on new science, technologies, and what regulatory bodies do to keep the public safe. So you need to be proactive and forward-thinking when it comes to managing risk. That means being open to new technologies, staying up to date on regulatory changes, and creating a culture of compliance across your whole organization.
You've really emphasized how important product safety is, the growing importance of digital compliance, especially with things like traceability, and how regulatory authorities and consumers are demanding more transparency when it comes to risk. What are some of the bad things that could happen to companies that aren't prepared for these changes?
The consequences can be pretty serious if you're not prepared. Companies could face big fines and maybe even worse, have to recall products, which can ruin their reputation and cost them a lot of money.
So staying alert, adapting, and committing to compliance are all absolutely essential. What specific steps would you urge our listeners to take after today's conversation?
Well, I'd strongly advise them to make sure they're always in the loop about new and updated regulations. They should be actively looking into technologies like blockchain, IoT, and AI and figuring out how to use them in their risk management processes. And they should prioritize training their employees and getting guidance from regulatory experts to make sure they're equipped to deal with this complex landscape.
This has been such an insightful and practical conversation. It's clear that if you want to be successful in this environment, you need a strong commitment to effective risk assessment, you need to be ready to embrace new technologies, and you need to have a strong culture of compliance. It really makes you think about the steps each organization needs to take to not just stay afloat, but really thrive in this evolving landscape.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.